Sarah Ferguson has been banished from the royal family in disgrace as she braces to move countries while the Epstein scandal rumbles on, a royal expert has claimed. Fergie, as she is affectionately known, found herself with no title or home after the king stripped his brother and her former husband, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, of his titles and honours due to his links to the convicted pedophile. The disgraced former prince agreed to leave his home, Royal Lodge, and move into one of the houses of the king's Sandringham estate following the furore. But the decision left Miss Ferguson essentially homeless, as she had been living with her ex-husband at the lavish Windsor mansion since 2008. Now a new bombshell report published by the Daily Express revealed that Sarah's youngest daughter, Princess Eugenie, is preparing a room for her at a £3.6 million luxury oceanfront villa in Portugal, owned by her and husband Jack Brooksbank, as the former Duchess braces to flee the UK. Now, a royal expert said that Miss Ferguson was a disaster as a working royal, and her recent bombshells with Epstein make it a wise and sensible decision for her to go into exile in Portugal. He told the Daily Express, "When in disgrace, it can be wise to go into exile." Sarah, in those first few days, was immediate, practical, and terrifyingly intimate. Home, as she had known it for 17 years, had evaporated. Royal Lodge, with its lichen-stained steps and the hush of centuries of protocol, had been handed back to the crown in stages. The former prince, her ex-husband, agreed to relocate within the dark hedges of Sandringham. The decision was announced with the same calm exactitude as the declarations that had preceded it. The world was told what to accept, and it accepted. But in the shadow of the official press releases came the less official details, the whispered acknowledgements, the unnamed royal sources, the barbed commentary of people who had once clapped for her and now shook their heads. Disastrous as a working royal, one pundit intoned on an evening program. Another called her resilient but problematic. They traced a tidy line between the mistakes she had made in public, dealing with money, with friendships, with the kind of ill-judged intimacy that makes for headline after headline, and the larger, murkier scandal that now swirled at the institution's margins. None of them paused long enough, perhaps, to think about the woman themselves, the laughter, the awkwardness, the softness within doggedness, who was suddenly reduced to a paragraph on page 3. For Sarah, the early hours were a map of rooms. She walked through the house she had shared with him for nearly 2 decades and catalogued what she could carry, what belonged to other lives, what could be left behind. Portraits, small badger-scented sachets from a childhood friend, a chipped teacup with a smear of lipstick still visible on the rim, all the relics of a life half-written. She slept when she could sleep, in borrowed dressing gowns, in corners of rooms where the servants had once treated her with a kind of tolerant affection. And then, in the midst of the fallout, came the quiet message that changed the tone of everything. "There is room for you here," it said, in a text from a hand she adored. Princess Eugenie, her youngest daughter, smaller now in the headlines, but fierce in the private messages that counted, had a house on the south coast of Portugal. It was a whitewashed villa that clung to a cliff like a thought that refused to fall, a property that the new family had purchased away from the press and the pattern of public scrutiny. They spoke of sun, of the Atlantic's slow inhale and exhale. They spoke of rooms with large doors that opened onto the sea. There was most importantly a spare study by a window that looked out over the waves. In the kaleidoscope of humiliation and the brittle, performative rebukes, this message felt like a small, private miracle. To accept it was to acknowledge what the palace had made plain, that a place in the central orbit was closed. To accept it was also to accept exile, but exile with a daughter's hand on the map.
There were those who greeted the news with glee. The pundits that loved to watch empires buckled smiled and said, "Wise and sensible," as if exile were a chess move. Others labeled it flight, a surrender to scandal. There were charitable trustees who removed names from directories and declined to be photographed with her at benefit dinners. There were friends who called and asked gently how she was coping with being suddenly less relevant. Sarah's own reaction was complicated. There was the practical, almost surgical part of her that began making lists: passports, documents, the address of the Portuguese villa, which charities needed to be informed, which papers could be shredded. There was the theatrical part, the woman who had always imagined reinventions and entrances, who could turn a simple appearance into a story that fed the cameras. And then there was the part that was simply weary, the one for whom scandal felt like scabbed over old bruises being picked at again. The villa was exactly as Eugenie had said, light, spare, with a scent of orange trees and an honest lack of pomp. The first days there were a study in slow realignment. Sarah walked along the cliff-top paths as if learning the geography of a new life. She found a bench that overlooked a bay and would sit there, fingers wrapped around a coffee cup, watching the fishing boats move like punctuation marks on the sea. She made lists of things she might do: a small charity in Lisbon, perhaps, an introduction to a women's initiative, a talk at a boutique literary festival where they would, if she played it right, pay to hear her frankness. But exile is not a repair kit. The old headlines followed. When the papers cried "banished," they meant it. The social media feeds were quick to pronounce judgment. She watched her name get strung through 1,000 hot takes and felt a strange mixture of humiliation and gratitude. Humiliation for the headline, gratitude for a daughter who had made room. It was in this liminal space between disgrace and reinvention that the 11th hour solution emerged. It took the form of a quiet conversation, not in a hotel suite or a studio, but across a kitchen table with 2 teacups between them. Eugenie had invited a group of close friends, a therapist who did pro bono work for women in distress, a lawyer who specialized in reputational management, and a close associate from the small charity they both supported in a previous life. They spoke without cameras and without commentators. There was no need to create spectacle. The aim was survival, and perhaps something stranger, redemption of a sort that had nothing to do with public approval. The first offer was practical, a plan to consolidate her finances, to negotiate any outstanding obligations quietly, to take the heat out of the merciless cycle of daily scandal. The second was about work. Stories needed to be told, they said, and stories can become tools. She could speak, carefully and with legal counsel, about what she'd seen, what she'd heard, what she remembered. Whether those things would be of interest to investigators or journalists or historians was uncertain, but the act of being a narrator of one's own life, rather than an object in someone else's paragraph, can be powerful. There were risks. There were blandishments, too. The chance to drift into celebrity memoir, which would be lucrative, but might return the worst of the public's appetite to spectacle. There was also the option of silence, of a small, private life spent in the company of family and friends. Eugenie made the case for neither and both. She told her mother, "Do it for the truth, not for the check." It sounded naive when spoken aloud, yet beneath the naive surface there was an integrity that felt new. That truth had value apart from scandal. When the 11th hour arrived, it did not arrive like a lightning bolt. It was a letter, written by a collective of charities that had once been ambivalent and now tentative, not endorsements, but invitations. if she would step down from certain public-facing roles and commit to a program of reparative work, speaking with at-risk youth, supporting victims' charities with time rather than image. A handful of organizations were willing to have her behind them, quietly, in a manner that did not attract tabloid cameras. Sarah read the letters 3 times. There were sentences that made her pulse quicken: recognition of past harm, an invitation to listen rather than speak, a desire to use her reach, however diminished, for something less self-serving. She felt the bones of a path in those paragraphs. They were small commitments, but they were honest. They allowed for acts that might, over time, build a reputation where spectacle no longer trumped substance. The first public step was humble. A small local library in a Portuguese coastal town agreed to host a reading where she would speak about the books that had helped her through illness and loss. There was no television crew, only a handful of local journalists and a larger group of local women who wanted to sit in the shade and listen. Sarah read, stumbled in places, laughed at herself with a rawness that the years of polish had often hidden. After the event, a woman came up and took her hand and, without asking for an autograph or a selfie, thanked her for telling a story that had helped her with grief. It was an exchange that could not be monetized, and that made it precious. There were setbacks. The tabloids continued to snipe about the decision to take refuge in Portugal, implying cowardice where there was merely discretion. The old acquaintances who had once been glad for her proximity declined to speak with her. There were moments of loneliness that the sea could not wash away. Yet in the spaces between those setbacks, other things took root. Eugenie and Jack were steady presences, turning family dinners into small rituals that had nothing to do with titles. Friends of her daughters, independent, sharp, modern-hearted, offered company without commentary. As weeks turned into months, her exile became less a sentence and more a recalibration. She was still a figure in the public imagination, but she was learning to be a figure on her own terms. She began to draft talks on resilience and second chances that were not about denial, but about the careful, difficult work of facing consequence. She took on an apprenticeship of sorts with a legal charity that offered pro bono advice to people embroiled in complex reputational disputes. In quiet rooms, she listened to people whose lives had been shattered by circumstance far worse than the shadows that had followed her. Listening, she learned again what humility looked like,